I want to introduce to you the people who will be doing the interview. First of all, the person who will be conducting the interview is Harry, who lives in Winnipeg and who works with and is part of Naomi House, which is a transitional house for refugees that was started by City Church. And he's been doing that for 4 years. And the person being interviewed is SJ Holsteen, who lives in Minneapolis-St. Paul and works with the International Association for Refugees, IAFR, and is a live-in worker at Jonathan House in St. Paul. And if you were on the last call, you know that two of the things that I love about Harry and SJ is that Harry loves coffee and SJ loves donuts. So you put them together and you've got the perfect meal, right? So I'm going to turn it over to Harry to get us started.
Hello, SJ.
Hello, Harry.
Hi, there you go. All right, so we'll get started. Like the rest of the world, many of us heard the news of George Floyd via social media, and that has ignited so much worldwide tension. So also, the image of George Floyd pleading for his life has caused so much deep reflection and opened mind so many people. But for you, SJ, where were you when you heard the news of George Floyd's death, and how did you react?
Yeah. A couple things. First, I just want to mention, I'm hoping that my internet collaborates with us this evening as well. So if you don't catch something that I say, I apologize, but we'll just try to, power through here. As way of context to your question, Harry, so as Sam mentioned, I live at Jonathan House in the Frogtown neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so Jonathan House provides safe and stable shelter to asylum-seeking individuals. And we have 2 houses, one that provides shelter for 4 individual men, and then the house where I live, I have 5 housemates. So I live with 3 women from Ethiopia and then a woman from Cameroon, and she has a 1-year son. Before the murder of George Floyd and the current protest movement, there was the coronavirus pandemic. And here in Minnesota, we were under stay-home orders for 2 months. And that was, as it has been for everybody, a very intense time of suddenly having, routine swept away and everything closed, and trying to reorient to life in the house. Thankfully, we like each other here, but it was still a pretty intense time. The stay-home orders lifted in mid-May, and as restrictions loosened a little bit, I decided that at the end of May, I would go visit my parents for a week in Wisconsin. So that's one piece of context. The other sort of piece of background information is, since 2016, I've frequently attended what is called the New School of African American Thought and Culture here in the Twin Cities, and that is a self-defined communiversity led by Black activists here in Minneapolis-St. Paul. And so every month they provide a free lecture and conversation in the community around topics about Black history, struggle, and liberation. And so in May, the speaker for New School was Jason Soul, who is the former president of NAACP in Minneapolis, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And he was presenting on prison abolition. And the discussion kind of centered around having community-based conversations about public safety and prioritizing transformative justice practices, because law enforcement in Black communities has been characterized by mass incarceration rates and police brutality. And so the overall message of the night was, let's have the preventative conversations, let's get the support structures in place that we need so that we can avoid relying on law enforcement because police aren't safe for us. Mm. So that conversation was Friday evening. Saturday, I went to Wisconsin, and then Monday night, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police. I saw the news Tuesday morning on BBC, and just seeing the headline, I knew, okay, it's on a non-US news site as a main headline. This soon after the event, it's bad. It's really bad. And then I clicked into the article and saw that it was Minneapolis. And so as things continued to unfold that week, it was pretty hard to be outside of the Twin Cities and just kind of see everything unrolling from a little bit of a remove. And then as events continued to escalate, by Friday of that week, I just decided, I preferred to be back at Jonathan House in St. Paul with my housemates. So I went back a little early.
Thank you, SJ. And I know I've learned that one of the strategies at Jonathan House that, there are, individual volunteers providing critical relational and emotional supports to the residents. And I think this is very fundamental on the psychological well-being of refugees. So, IFR Jonathan House, provide housing to asylum-seeking refugees, and most of whom are people of color. Now, you yourself live at one of the houses in St. Paul, as you mentioned, which was close to the sites of the civil unrest. What were the questions or tensions you found yourself faced with at IFR Jonathan House in immediate aftermath of George Floyd murder?
So, as you mentioned, I think the primary questions as the civil unrest increased were questions of re-traumatization, and also with the video of George Floyd, and questions of security. So on Tuesday and Wednesday, the response to George Floyd's killing was it was contained to Minneapolis, but then on Thursday it spilled over into St. Paul. And I first became aware of that because I received a phone call from my housemate. I was still in Wisconsin at the time, but I received this phone call and I could hear shouting and sirens in the background. And she was at our local supermarket when looting had started nearby. And so they locked down the supermarket and started, pushing people out the back and, shouting for them to leave the area immediately. And police were descending on the scene, and my housemate was kind of stranded, right? People were hopping in their cars and driving away. And because of history of forced displacement. You know, there were multiple levels that made that a stressful situation for her. So thankfully, you know, a teammate of mine was able to pick her up and get her home pretty quickly. But, you know, that kind of raised the question for us of, okay, you know, are there situations here that could be re-traumatizing? And as it moved into the evening, then, you know, we were receiving reports of buildings that were being burned down or looted within a mile of each of the Jonathan House sites. And so as a team, then we kind of started having conversations about whether we needed to relocate people. But I think, you know, when it comes to trauma, there's also a question of agency, right? Like trauma involves a loss of agency. And so we realized as a team, you know, well, if we go in as Jonathan House staff without explaining the situation and just say, you know, it's not safe here, we need to leave, that could actually heighten trauma. And so we decided that it would be best to just really clearly communicate what was going on. And, you know, I think there was a little bit of tension in that for me, even just because, you know, around these kind of racially charged events, like I just felt really aware of like the language that I was using to describe it. You know, like, how are you constructing the narrative? But we, you know, we told them what had happened, that, you know, George Floyd had been killed and that there were protests in this response. And we explained, you know, the impacts on the city in terms of, you know, curfews and, you know, wanting public transit being shut down, just so they felt like they had a sense, you know, and could sort of interpret what they saw going on around them. And, you know, once our residents heard what had happened and had a chance to, you know, kind of articulate what they were experiencing and felt, everybody, you know, communicated, well, we feel comfortable and safe here. So we decided, you know, we had an evacuation plan in our back pocket, but we decided to just stay and continue to monitor the situation. So security and re-traumatization was a question that we dealt with. For me personally, rethinking my engagement with protest and activism. It was kind of interesting I took part in some marches and demonstrations, and it was interesting to have, you know, the feedback of my housemates on that. I had one housemate that said, you know, that's good. You should protest. Like, this man deserves justice. He should be treated with dignity and respect. And then I had another housemate, you know, who I tried to explain, like, this is where I'm going. This is what will happen. This is who will be there. But I, you know, could tell that there was some concern about how my involvement in protests could impact the house, right? She made a comment about, like, okay, well, was it calm there? Because if it wasn't calm and somebody followed you back to the house, right, and like recorded your driver's license, you know, your license plate number or something like that. So, you know, it just made me kind of aware of what concerns people might be carrying about civic engagement and civil protests and things like that. And it also made me realize, you know, there might be better, more effective ways that I can you know, use my voice and advocate that aren't maybe as visible, right? and might not raise the kinds of concerns or stresses that going to a protest might for those, for my housemates. And then finally, this is something that you talked about in our previous conversations, just the idea of, you know, racial identity and historical narratives. You know, I think it was just a reminder for us that just because someone would be identified as Black here in the US, they won't necessarily, you know, recognize themselves as Black because they're coming from, you know, an African country. And so, you know, one of my housemates who is Black African just said very clearly, like, this is not our issue. You know, some other residents at Jonathan House, like, they were able to relate to, you know, the pain of George Floyd's murder and the civil unrest, but they kind of would contrast it in terms of scale and severity to what they have experienced in their home countries. And, you know, one of our male residents said, you know, like, if a policeman kills you where I come from, like, you're just a drop in the ocean. If at least if I was killed here, I know someone would care, which is a pretty stark statement. But, you know, trying to hold that intention, right, with the realities of the neighborhoods where we live and the histories of oppression, displacement, and just racial trauma that reside here, particularly with, you know, American Black communities and Indigenous communities. So, you know, just trying to sort of recognize, like, the Black racial identity might be given to asylum seekers who are coming from Africa or other diaspora nations, but that is not necessarily something that they identify with, and they may not be comfortable accepting. But also kind of wrestling with, okay, even if you aren't familiar with sort of the history of racial relations in the US, or you don't want to identify, that doesn't necessarily mean you won't be a target. And you kind of shared that with your own experience, right, with the police after you had been in Winnipeg for 6 months. So just kind of asking the question, like, what part do we play in helping Black refugees make sense of the story that they find themselves in? And also trying to be pretty critical about what kind of lens or interpretation I, as a white person, would have in trying to help somebody navigate that, because it wouldn't be the full story.
So SJ, I've read that this event along the killing of George Floyd has, triggered civic unrest at a scale not seen since the assassination of Martin Luther King. And so, for you, SJ, what are the long-term impact will George Floyd murder and this present movement for racial justice have on your work with forcibly displaced individuals in the Minneapolis-St area?
So I think back to the fact that I was in Wisconsin, about 40 minutes away from St. Paul, when George Floyd was murdered. And when I came back to our neighborhood here 4 days later, the landscape had literally changed, right, because of the civil unrest. And strangely, I think one of the things that it made me realize was that myself am actually an outsider here. I have lived in St. Paul for a year and a half. I actually have some of my asylum-seeking housemates who have lived in the Twin Cities longer than I have, right? And there's a Minneapolis podcaster named Sam Graber. He has a podcast called American Refugee. And in his podcast episode he did on George Floyd, he had this phrase where he said, you know, it could have been anywhere, but it happened here. And that kind of stuck with me, and it made me ask the question, like, oh, so where is here? Like, and who is here? You know, like that's research that I have to do for myself, right? Like that's stuff that I have to educate myself on. Because the idea that I can help orient someone to a place that I myself do not know, or if I didn't intend to know it in a deeper way, right? I think there's some white hubris in that. And the idea that maybe I'm the best person, right, to orient someone to systems in the United States, when as a white person, I often, you know, benefit unmerited privilege from those systems at the expense of other people, oftentimes. I think that's something that should be critically questioned, or something that I need to be imminently aware of, right, as I engage with forcibly displaced individuals. I really appreciated the focus on place, the theme of place at the RHPNA roundtable in Toronto. And so, you know, I think in sort of the long term, what we have discussed as a local IAFR team here is that we just really have a need and a desire to better understand the place that we're living in. And in particular to, you know, better understand the communities that have been historically displaced or marginalized here. Because, you know, I live in Frogtown neighborhood in St. Paul, and just south of my neighborhood, there was a thriving Black community neighborhood, the Rondo neighborhood, that, you know, back in the 1950s was a victim of redlining and was destroyed so that the interstate could be built. And south of the Twin Cities, like in 1862, there was the largest mass execution in US history, when 38 Dakota Indians were hanged by the order of President Lincoln. So, you know, there are these layers of history that I think we need a team working with forcibly displaced people to be able to acknowledge and recognize the impacts that they have had on communities of color here. But I think it's also, I'm feeling like, you know, it's not just the histories of marginalization and displacement that we need to be looking for or acknowledging. There's also, you know, stories of resilience and innovation and contribution that these racially and ethnically diverse communities have given to this place. And so I think, you know, our local team is wanting to make space to hear from the voices of communities of color here, and you know, show that they are valued, and acknowledge for ourselves and for the forcibly displaced people that we work with, that those communities make us better, and are crucial to the story. I think that's one of the things that I appreciate about New School, right? Is you realize that there are community leaders of color who are doing a lot of important work and forging really creative solutions to a whole gamut of issues, including education, justice, mental health, the arts, housing, etc. So just being able to listen and learn from them, and have them support them in leading those. So I think we're looking for opportunities as a team to educate ourselves about the Native populations whose stolen land we live on, and to learn what the land means to them. We're looking to make connections with Black pastors, or forge relationships with Black community members here who could also connect with Jonathan House and with our residents to share what their experiences have been as a person of color in the US. I think we'd like to familiarize ourselves better with some of the racially and ethnically diverse, just like neighborhood organizations where the Jonathan House sites are. And we've also talked about maybe like incorporating field trips with our asylum-seeking friends at Jonathan House, just so they can also have the opportunity to learn, the good, the bad, the ugly about the different stories that there are in this new place that they've come to, and sort of figure out for themselves like where they want to place themselves in their new communities here. So what the long-term impacts of that will be, I have no idea. Like, it's really just starting, and I think it's going to be hopefully like a lifelong learning, right, as a ministry. So there's no like immediate, this is what we're going to accomplish with these steps, which can make it feel kind of impractical or superfluous. But it feels pretty essential to us, I think, as people who are working with forcibly displaced individuals, to be able to acknowledge the US legacy of forcible displacement. And as, people who believe firmly in the beauty of God-initiated cultural diversity, to be able to acknowledge the contributions of communities of color here. So, like in Acts, when Paul is in Athens, he talks about how from one man God created all nations of men. And he appointed the times in history and the boundaries of their lands. And he did that so that they can seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. And I think that's kind of the invitation that we're sensing right now at IAFR Minneapolis-St. Paul, is just to say, where have you been at work, and where are you at work in this incredibly complex city, place that you have led us to.
One thing that I've noticed here from the many people that I'm connected with, is that they are into the whole movement for a day or two, and after that they totally forget what is happening. And I think I've learned that catalytic moments are not just for a day or two. You have to push into so many moments for a lifetime of learning and transformation, just like you mentioned. And so I'm going to ask you these questions, and I'm going to open it up to the audience as well. What are the opportunities do you think those who are engaged in refugee work have to add an anti-racist lens to their work, or to address wider issues of racial equality and justice in the communities they work?
So just as maybe some guiding questions, hopefully, it will start with listening and learning and bearing witness. So Harry, in our last conversation, you talked about settlement agencies that you had interacted with in Canada, and they were kind of transactional in nature. And there was kind of this sense that they were engaging with refugees or refugee claimants towards sort of an intended outcome, right? And then we also talked about the strength and the opportunities that there are in churches to be able to engage in relationship, right? And to befriend and be with newcomers, and really just go the long road together. And so I think, just a question for us engaged in refugee work is, are you engaging with refugees with sort of a desired outcome in mind of how they will, act or change or adapt? Or are we open, and are we desiring to be listeners and learners and to be challenged and changed in mutual relationship? The other thing, I think, for most of us who are in refugee or cross-cultural work, there is a lot of robust discussion around cultural humility. Sort of the idea of learning to be reflective about our own cultural values, right? And to not sort of judge or label cultural difference, but to just try to understand it. I'm not sure that there's as much conversation. I think this is happening more now, and hopefully will continue, but I don't think there is as much discussion or practice about reflecting on power dynamics, or sort of critically reflecting on systems that we either engage with or that we actually operate within in our work. So maybe just some questions to be thinking about related to that is, the systems that you engage with or operate within, like what are those systems values? Do we even sort of think about systems as having values, or do we think of them as sort of inherently neutral, right? And we feel like we have a role as followers of Jesus to challenge systems whose values or whose fruit does not reflect his kingdom. Because I know, like me, it can be really easy for me to feel like, oh, I'm a good person, engaged in charitable work, helping vulnerable people. But I don't always ask why they are vulnerable. And I think, when we start to ask those questions, a lot of times we realize that it's almost like often it is a systemically constructed vulnerability, and it is a systemically maintained vulnerability. So just being able to ask those questions, I think, in your own context, in your own ministries, can, we'll see where God leads you. So I'll kind of leave it at that for right now. I'd love to hear what other people's thoughts or questions are.
Thank you so much, SJ.
Thanks, SJ. I'm going to jump in now. We thought we could use the last 17 minutes of the call to hear from some of you. Probably most people who get involved in areas of compassion ministry or charitable works or justice ministries do so with a certain lens. There's something that draws us into it. But then there's something about the work itself that causes us to reflect on some of these deeper things or larger things, some of which we've talked about tonight. So we thought it would be a good discussion, and it may be a new discussion for some of us. It may be a new aspect, a new lens, but it'd be interesting to hear from one another about how we might have this anti-racist lens, this lens that deals with the systems that we're in. If there's something you perhaps are doing, if something perhaps you've thought about, how you've heard stories reflected in the refugees that you work with. So we kind of want to throw it wide open. We didn't want to make it too specific a question, simply because it is a very large issue, and we understand that people are in different places here. So we have 19 people right now on the call, and I can't see all of you. So feel free to, well, all of you are welcome to turn your video on if you want to. You don't have to. But if you want to jump in with a thought, something from your own experience, that would be great. And yeah, if you have some questions too, you can place them in the chat. But feel free to jump in right now with a thought about how this anti-racist conversation, this lens, gets woven into what you do, even if you haven't thought of it like that until now.
I'm Dennis Nelson from Tucson, and I grew up in Minneapolis and lived in St. Paul. We're working with a refugee family, been here 3 years. How do we help this family recognize racism, respond to it as they can, but not just look for it?
Dennis, were you addressing that question to the group or to Harry or SJ, or do you
Harry or SJ,
okay.
anybody that could come to that.
Yeah, I think I can definitely answer to that. I don't think they'll have to look for it. It's it is there. So they will be attending schools, communities. They'll be interacting with people. So I think that is the most important thing that you can do at the moment is just kind of having that conversation with them first. Kind of just letting them know that these places, institutions that will be attending, there'll be different questions that may be a bit off or may not be at the level that you may not understand clearly. But again, just so you know, if something like this happens when you're not sure, you are there, you're working with them at the moment. So the knowing that you're there to kind of facilitate that, transition from having conversation from other different communities, that would be very much helpful, which I think is something that I liked a lot when I arrived here, is that somebody telling me that, when you go to school, you can be facing these sort of challenges, but also at the same time, who do I go talk to when I'm going through those challenges? So I think you can play a very much important role in that family, letting them know that, it's sometimes a concern.
Thank you. The oldest boy just turned 19, and he's driving now. So I had the talk with him about, if you're stopped for police, and he recognized that. It was very helpful. The middle daughter, who's about 14, I did ask her about hearing the N-word. And she recognized that she heard it. It wasn't directed at her, but she heard it at school. And the school is a wonderful school. It has over 100 English language learners, many of them from Africa. And so I've gone slowly, really trying to listen more than try to educate them.
I would say another way that you might be able to support that family and just allow them to kind of navigate that journey and feel empowered is to know what their rights are, because I think sometimes newcomers might not know what their rights are in terms of interactions with law enforcement or school officials, or in the healthcare realm. And so just thinking about those areas where they might experience discrimination or bias or racism, and empowering them with information that would allow them to know, right, when they have a right and are able to, you know, assert their equality and their dignity, and you know, appeal for justice if needed.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Anybody else?
I was just thinking about, this is Rob, I'm in Toronto. I was thinking about that last comment SJ just made, and I have a background first where I was in a community urban church setting where we had a lot of challenging relations between the community and the police. And then from there, I went into refugee work in a home very similar to the one SJ has been talking about. In my course, in my first job, even though we had a lot of challenges with community and police, I got 2 police officers that I became close with, and I developed trust with, and I felt we could talk about things and etc. When moving into the refugee home setting, I invited them up occasionally, informally, to sit down with the residents and answer questions, talk about what it means to deal with police in Canada, their rights, and I can't remember if it was Harry or SJ talking about, you know, I think SJ, you were saying one of your residents talking about, oh, like, if I was killed in my country, it wouldn't even be a big deal or whatever. And just some of our residents knowing they have rights, right, because of their background, it was very helpful. And we don't all have those relationships that can come in, but that was a helpful thing, I think, for the residents, because those particular police officers, actually both of them, neither of them were actually born in Canada themselves, and so they had a very good perspective.
Yeah, I could maybe jump in and say we do the same thing. We have a regular set of workshops for people who live in our shelter, and one of them is we have a police officer come in to help them understand how the police work and what they should be able to expect from good law enforcement and what their rights are and so forth. Because of course, many come from countries where that's not an expectation, so they don't even know they have the right to that. So it's a very helpful conversation, I think. Anyone else with thoughts or perhaps a story of how you interacted with a displaced person you were working with around this issue?
Kevin, in Columbus, Ohio, I guess a question or some thoughts. Or I've encountered with people of Somali, really are an adamant that they are not African American. Very strong feeling of not wanting to be associated with African Americans. I mean, I've been told, we really like white people like you, but not so sure we're very thrilled with African Americans. But just thoughts of, what do you think, what is kind of behind that, or what may be leading to that kind of feeling? Have you run into that, and an appropriate way to kind of maybe help uncover what might be behind those kind of thoughts?
Harry, do you want to share, or should I share
Sure.
a little bit?
I can go ahead. I wouldn't say, I mean, I've probably had the same thought for quite a while. And I think there was that, image of, superiority, being white, as in, grow back home, you see a white person, you see help. You see white person, you see opportunity, you see white person, you see so many other different things that are quite different than yours. So that really created a certain image of who a white person is. Coming here as well with, our parents telling us that, you need to be in USA, you need to be in Canada and take, all the opportunity that you can just grasp to anything that you can. Just keep moving. Don't look back, or don't just get yourself involved with anything, just anything at all. So I think that image alone is kind of destroying our mental well-being in seeing who is a white person, and that all just I think just kind of falls within the conversation, having that conversation, you know, erasing that mindset.
Yeah, you know, I would say I have encountered that a little bit with asylum-seeking individuals who are coming from African countries, and I think some things that I have heard just from like immigration advocates or asylum seeker advocates who themselves are Black is that that's actually kind of like Harry is saying, it's a narrative that has been shared in Africa, right? Or from the time that they were in Africa of like, you shouldn't associate with Black communities in the US. And these immigration advocates were kind of making the point like, in some ways that was sort of, you know, sort of like this dominant narrative or dominant cultural narrative or like white supremacist narrative that was imposed upon us and kind of like separated us from people that we would probably have some things in common with, right? Or would be able to learn from once we came to the United States. So they kind of saw it as like in retrospect, as an attack against Blackness and against sort of solidarity between Black people of different nations. I think part of it is probably also founded in just the different histories that folks have, and you know, acknowledging that there is a very specific history of racial trauma that the Black community in the U.S. has, and so there just might not be a sense of, you know, being able to see each other in each other's stories, right? Or relate to each other in those different stories of oppression. But I've also kind of heard from recently arrived asylum seekers, you know, I think because they don't have those, they have separate histories, there has also been a sense sometimes of like, why are the, you know, Black Americans, you know, sort of making a big deal about having inequitable rights when they have all of these support structures, and back where I came from, you know, it's just a matter of survival, and you know, life is so much worse. So those are some things.
Thanks, Harry and SJ. Yeah, I think in tonight's call, we've used the lens of race and anti-racism, but of course, another whole lens is culture, which is a more even nuanced and complex conversation. And as SJ and Harry have said, this, you know, every culture has a story, has a narrative that also positions them in relation to other cultures and other races. And you know, so sometimes that's, you know, that's just a story they come with. And sometimes, you know, helping the people we work with just see the other person as an individual as opposed to a group, you know, because there's also group identity and individual identity, you know, being human versus being of a certain race or culture. So there are different, I think, conversations that need to happen at the right time. And that's why, as both Harry and SJ have said in this call and the previous call, you know, being in deeper relationship with people so that it's not just transactional, but actually a relationship that's a safe space where those conversations are pretty important. I want to honor the time. We've just got a minute left. I'm wondering, did Harry or SJ, do you have any parting thoughts? And after that, we'll close in prayer. And if you're on the call, you're going to get a survey tomorrow, and just we'd like to know your thoughts on this. But there's also an opportunity, we're at the Refugee Highway Partnership. Obviously, we're not in a space right now where we're being able to organize regional in-person roundtables or a North American roundtable this year anyway. And so we're working harder at doing some of this kind of work online, either through blogs or through these kinds of calls. So if there are other issues, it doesn't have to be related to racism. It can be a whole other issue that you would love to see a topic on, or if there's something you or someone you know might have to offer, just type that into the survey, because the leadership team will be meeting in a couple of weeks, and we'd love to get your input on that. So Harry or SJ, any last thoughts before I close this prayer?
A couple. They'll be fast. So this is just one other thing that I was thinking about in response to your question, Kevin, was I think one of the things that I've also heard from Black immigrant advocates is one of the things that was kept from them were the great contributions that Black Americans have historically made. It's always been kind of a one-sided picture. So that's maybe something that we who are engaging with refugees can be intentional about as well, is just make sure that we're educating ourselves about the richness and of the histories of the different communities of color, and being able to vocalize and share those with refugee friends. And I think the other thing that I would just encourage at the end here is whatever your different ministry contexts are, wherever you are, how can you have your ministry and your responses and your engagement with anti-racism, how can you have that shaped by the particularities of your place, right? And the people and the stories that reside there. So what does full-bodied kingdom shalom look like in your churches, in your ministries, and in your communities?
Thanks, SJ. Harry, anything?
I think SJ kind of summarized everything there. But to add to that is that may we continue when we learn to love one another as Jesus loved us. May we continue to seek justice, love, mercy, and then may we continue to walk humbly before God.
Amen. Well, let me close this in prayer. God, thank you that you love diversity, because you sure created a lot of it. And we marvel at the richness of the people groups that are here on the planet that we get to share the planet with. And we pray that as people who work with, stand for, and walk with displaced people, that we will be agents of your shalom, of your peace, of your kingdom in their lives, but also in the systems in which they find themselves. God, our deepest prayer is that your kingdom will become and your will be done here on earth, here in North America at this time, as it is in heaven. And we pray in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.